because I invented this job title myself, or rather, I stole it from the State Department, because there's a position in the State Department called the Counselor, which you don't hear about very much, and whose functions are very obscure. There have been times when, for example, in 1989, the Counsel of the State Department was Bob Zellick, who played actually a rather distinguished role at the time. And there have been one or two other interesting people who've done this job, but it's never been very clear what they do. And I thought this was an ideal arrangement for myself. Actually, it also comes back to the first annual appraisal I had in the Foreign Office, which said, Mr. Cooper seems to have the potential to be a good official, but he has a regrettable tendency to concentrate on the subjects that interest him. And this is my job description at the moment. However, I won't talk about what I do day to day. I'll talk a little bit more widely about Europe. I believe very strongly that as far as Europe is concerned, this is a moment of change. Well, it's a long moment of change because changes in history take place over a long time. The reason I wore this particular tie today, for those, this is a tie of Italian. You can see bits of Florence, Pisa, Rome, and so on. It's a tie of Renaissance Italy. And I imagine Europe today like Renaissance Italy, one of the high points of civilization. The city-states invented the beginnings, not of the Industrial Revolution, but the beginning of industrialization, the beginning of textile production, the beginning of banking, the greatest works of art really since Greece and Rome. One of the real great moments of civilization. And one of the great Italians of the time, Niccolo Machiavelli, actually at least 100 years ahead of his time in his thinking and writing. Writing in The Prince, what always seems to me to be a plea for Italian unification. It's not just the last chapter, actually the whole book is about Italian unification. Because he's writing at a time in 1517, after France is more or less a state by this time. In Britain, in 1485, the Wars of the Roses finished, and you have with the Tudors something like an early modern state emerging. In 1485, the same time as the date the last Russian-speaking province joined Moscow. 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella unite Spain. Now these are not exactly states as we know them today, but they're something very different from the way in which Italy was organized in city-states, who were economically and culturally fantastically strong, and militarily and politically very weak. And the history of Italy since then has been some combination of domination by others and historical irrelevance, because of the failure to meet the requirements of the new world. Well, there are many explanations of that. Machiavelli blames the church, which I think is as good a reason as but at any rate, that doesn't matter. The fact is that that we also, Europe, also has represented a high point of civilization. But we're now very slowly moving into a new world in which medium-sized and small states are exactly that. They're medium-sized and small. And the world is going to be dominated, not necessarily in a kind of military way as it was in the from the Renaissance onwards in Europe, but the world is going to be dominated by much larger units, by China, India, the USA, Brazil, and we'll see about the rest. That's up to them, and it's up to us. And so I think if anybody in Europe wishes to remain historically relevant, wishes to have some control over their destiny, then I think they have to act in a European way. This is not the view, as far as I can tell, of the Conservative Party in Britain. They believe in some rather distant, I don't know what they believe in. They believe that they can somehow defend something that they call British national interest on their own. And I think that's completely false. They believe perhaps that that Britain's so-called special relationship with America is somehow going to look after them. Well, it's looked after them very well in Iraq and Afghanistan so far. So I don't see much point in that. It's perfectly clear that if Obama is going to make one telephone call to Europe, it's not David Cameron who chooses to make it to either. So this is another way of being historically relevant. I guess that being historically relevant can also be quite pleasant. Norway is a very nice country, and Switzerland also is a very nice country. And if one wishes to live as in that sort of way, perhaps there's nothing wrong with it. But I don't think, I would still feel myself uncomfortable with that, because you never know what's going to happen. And there may come some point when you need to defend yourself in whatever way, I don't know, against larger forces in the world, in which you need to try and influence the world. So I think that would not be, for me, that would not be an attractive course to take. If you ask where this world has come from, the world in which we look ahead at China and India and places like that, and imagine how things are going to be in 30 or 40 years' time, they won't be like that. I mean, I'm sure that both China and India will continue to make progress. I suspect it will be a bit slower than some of the projections imply, but I'm also sure that eventually the natural equilibrium of things will assert themselves, and Europe will return to being what it is by nature, which is the western end of the Eurasian landmass, with a peculiarly attractive climate and a particularly, well, and an amazing history and an amazing historical endowment. But the natural order of things is not that Europe should rule the world, which is what we did since, I don't know when, middle of the 18th century. And so we have to live in a world in which we are one among many. But how that has come about is at least partly because of the very long period of peace that we've enjoyed. For me, what seems remarkable in today's world is that in spite of all of the continuing problems, turmoil in the Middle East, regular little crises in Africa, for us, unsettled problems in the Balkans, risks in places like North Korea, you don't get the faintest smell of great power conflict. In North Korea, for example, the countries which at different points over the last 100 years or so, fought major wars in North Korea, spend most of their time trying to quieten in the Korean Peninsula, not North Korea. Those are the same 6 countries which spend most of their time trying to quieten North Korea down and trying to find peaceful solutions, dealing with actually a pretty crummy little country. Not a really a big nuisance rather than a big threat. In a way, you can see the same thing happening with Iran. An international coalition attempting to prevent trouble rather than using this as an excuse for trouble. In the Balkans, it's a bit less clear because it seems to me from time to time that the Russians want to see if they can make trouble, but they're not very serious either. So I wouldn't, one should never rule out the possibility of stupidity in international relations, but it's quite striking that amid all of this, you don't find much in the way of international tension. If you think of other long periods of peace, a long period of peace following the Franco-Prussian War, towards the end there was a continual series of incidents between Britain and France, France and Germany. There was a tension rising towards World War I. Exactly the opposite now. And the real, if there's been any lesson of the last 10 years, it's been the failure of military power in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Now, as I say, one can never exclude stupidity, and there is an unresolved question in the Far East about China and the USA and perhaps Japan as well. And at some point that might become dangerous, but it would require a colossal stupidity, which is always possible, but which we don't see for the moment. And out of this world, in which the economy has become much more global than ever before, we face a different series of risks from the ones that we are used to from previous centuries. And these are the risks of a much more integrated global economy. We see them today. What is President Obama worrying about in Europe? Well, it's no longer the Berlin Wall and the Warsaw Pact. It's the euro. How did we get into this situation? Well, I guess you've probably had a long discussion on that, and we can have a different one. There are many different explanations. But part of the explanation is the weaknesses of the euro system were a result of the subprime crisis in the USA. And the subprime crisis would have been bad if it had been confined to the USA, but actually most European banks bought into these ridiculous securities. But the subprime crisis in the USA was sustained in some way by first of all, it was caused, at least partly, by the great inequalities in American society and the attempt to compensate for those by providing cheap housing loans. But it was also sustained by the particular structure of the Chinese economy, where the Chinese government wishes above all to keep manufacturing industry active, because that's the way in which you produce employment more easily than any other. So China needs to export, and therefore, and because it has a gigantic surplus, it needs to lend it somewhere, so credit is cheap in America, etc., etc. All of these things taking place, domestic events taking place in different parts of the world, now interact with each other in a way in which I don't think has ever happened before. And that we see in finance at the moment. The other area, it happens also in the area of energy. The other thing going on today in Durban, I think, is we see a curious alliance of the European Union and small island states on the question of the environment, which will, I'm personally convinced, become an increasingly pressing issue in the next period. So, so the same phenomena which creates a kind of a global economy which is responsible for the growing importance of places like China and India, this same peaceful environment also creates a series of a new series of international problems. But the international problems are not just pure international problems, they're also always connected to local politics, because the decisions are still always made locally. The decisions about the euro are made as a result of a peculiar mixture of local politics and an international economy. And that, I think, is the great problem of the age now, that we have a very high degree of economic integration in the world, and politics remains completely local. So, if you want to deal with that, if we want to deal with that in the European Union, I think that we have a fantastic opportunity. In that we have at the center of Europe a rather technically competent body in the shape of the Commission, which has got great depth of expertise in areas like financial services, energy, environment. At the same time, we have a whole bunch of European diplomatic services with very strong traditions and very talented people who have got long traditions of working in foreign countries, understanding local politics, even if they're lucky, perhaps manipulating it, but at any rate knowing how to work with that. And I think the task in the future now is to try and bring those things together. But I don't see any alternative. I don't think that Europe really works, but I don't think that the national governments really work that well either. The only way is to build something better at a European level. I was particularly struck with it once visiting Sarajevo and addressing the 20 heads of European diplomatic missions in Sarajevo and asking myself, I wonder why they're all here. Is it because there are 20 different policies towards Bosnia? Well, the answer to that was definitely not. We think there are 20 different policies?
5 or 6, I would think.
There are one or two. There are one or two divergences, but they're pretty stupid on the whole. And there are some particular national interests as well. If you're Austria, I guess that there are large commercial interests in Bosnia. But for the rest, on the whole, no. There isn't that very much different that they do. If you ask yourself, what is the total expenditure of these 20 diplomatic missions, And then, are they collectively more or less effective than the single diplomatic mission from the USA? I'm pretty sure I know what the answer to that is. I'm not saying that we should abolish all European diplomatic missions and just have a national missions and just have a single European mission. I hope in Sarajevo, where we now have a rather effective head of mission, that gradually this will become a sort of a kind of hub around which the other European missions will operate in a coordinated fashion. For me, these are the places which really represent the front line in international politics. Fine, you need to be well represented in Washington, Ottawa, and such places, in Washington, they will be interested in talking to Europeans who are effective in places like Pakistan. There are some exceptions. China is a place where one needs a strong diplomatic representation because the place is so difficult to deal with. Otherwise, it's frequently places which are not so grand. It's places like Pakistan these days, how you're represented in Syria, in Libya, in Tunisia, also matters. And for many of these places, I guess the French probably send somebody good to Tunisia. But as far as Britain is concerned, for example, this is a sort of second, third level post. You don't get your best people there. And yet, if you want to deal with a situation such as you have in Tunisia at the moment, you need to have extremely good people on the spot. For me, I've always thought that the idea of being the European ambassador in somewhere in North Africa, say, was much more interesting than being the British ambassador. One ought to be able to get better people to do these. And the job of diplomats is always potentially a very difficult one. It's often a very boring one because nothing much happens and you've got nothing much to do. It's actually, I think that we British understand it well because it's like cricket, where you hang around doing nothing for a long time and then suddenly something important happens and you're expected to catch the ball. And that's how it is in diplomacy. You actually, to be useful in a place like Tunisia today, you need to have somebody who has got talent, personality, and some kind of serious backing in terms of probably money and access to trade and things like that. I think that one is much more likely to be able to do that at a European level than at a national level, especially if the national level turns out to be 20 different people. One's much more likely to be able to get a high-quality diplomatic representation at the European level. And at the same time, we're more likely to be able, if we can make it work, and this is still, I think, a difficult challenge, we're more likely to be able bringing together the resources of the European Union to deal internationally with questions like environment and energy through diplomatic missions that understand local politics and know how to interact with local politics. So that's why I believe in the External Action Service.